In 1859, on the outskirts of Charleston, South Carolina, during a Thanksgiving feast meant to celebrate abundance and divine providence, 12 white men died in agony within the walls of the Whitmore plantation's great house. Their deaths were not the result of disease or accident, but the deliberate act of a 32-year-old enslaved woman named Hattie, who had served the Whitmore family since childhood and who, on that November evening, transformed a religious celebration into a mass execution that would haunt Charleston society for generations. You are watching Shadows of the South, where we unearth the most disturbing and forgotten stories of the slave-holding South. Stories that reveal the psychological horror and moral bankruptcy that defined an entire civilization built upon human bondage. The Whitmore plantation stretched across 1,500 acres of prime low-country land, its fields thick with Sea Island cotton that commanded premium prices in Liverpool and Boston markets. Colonel Marcus Whitmore, 53 years old, was a third-generation planter who had inherited not only the land but also a rigid code of paternalistic tyranny that he believed made him both master and benevolent father to the 240 souls he claimed as property. Educated at the College of Charleston and steeped in the classical traditions that Southern gentlemen used to justify their dominion, Whitmore was known throughout the district as a man of culture who quoted Aristotle to defend slavery and who maintained that the peculiar institution was ordained by God and nature alike. His wife, Constance, 48, was the daughter of a prominent Savannah family, a woman whose piety and social ambition made her a fixture in Charleston's Episcopal circles, yet whose religious devotion coexisted with a casual cruelty toward the enslaved people who dressed her, fed her, and maintained the fiction of her superiority. Hattie had been born on the Whitmore plantation in 1827, the daughter of a field hand named Sarah, and a father whose identity was never acknowledged, but whose European features were evident in Hattie's lighter complexion and hazel eyes. By the age of 8, she had been brought into the great house to work under the supervision of the head cook, Mama Celia, a woman of 60 who had served 3 generations of Whitmores, and who taught Hattie not only the culinary arts, but also the delicate psychology of survival in a world where every word, every gesture, every glance could result in violence. Hattie learned to read the moods of white faces, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to make herself simultaneously indispensable and invisible. She learned which herbs could soothe a headache and which could induce sleep, knowledge passed down through generations of enslaved women who had used botany as both medicine and occasional weapon. By 1859, Hattie had spent 24 years in the Whitmore kitchen, her hands preparing every meal, her eyes witnessing every family drama, her ears hearing every whispered confidence and drunken confession that the Whitmores believed their slaves could not comprehend. The events that led to the Thanksgiving massacre began not in 1859, but years earlier, in the accumulated weight of daily degradations and specific violences that the historical record only hints at through court documents and letters. Hattie had given birth to 4 children between 1843 and 1854, all of whom were sold away from the plantation before their 10th birthdays, a practice Colonel Whitmore justified as necessary for maintaining discipline and preventing emotional attachments that might make slaves less pliable. The father of at least 2 of these children was widely understood to be the colonel's eldest son, James, who had exercised what he considered his natural prerogative over the enslaved women of the plantation before his death from yellow fever in 1856. Hattie's last child, a girl named Lucy, born in 1854, had been sold to a trader heading to the Mississippi Delta when she was 4 years, despite Hattie's pleading and Mama Celia's intervention. After Lucy's sale, witnesses would later report, something in Hattie changed. Her face became a mask. Her efficiency in the kitchen became almost mechanical. She stopped singing the work songs that had once marked the rhythm of food preparation, and she began to collect and catalog the herbs and roots that grew in the marshy areas beyond the quarters with a new intensity of purpose. The immediate trigger for the massacre came in early November 1859, when Constance Whitmore decided to host an elaborate Thanksgiving celebration that would showcase the plantation's prosperity and the family's social standing. 12 neighboring planters and their male relatives were invited for a feast that would include every delicacy the Low Country could provide: roasted turkey and venison, oysters from the coast, sweet potatoes candied with molasses, cornbread and biscuits, pies made with pecans and blackberries, and the Colonel's prized Madeira wine. The preparation would fall entirely to Hattie and the kitchen staff, who would work for 3 days to produce a meal meant to demonstrate white supremacy through culinary abundance. On November 15th, while reviewing the menu, Constance Whitmore casually mentioned to Hattie that Lucy, now 9 years old, had died of consumption on a Mississippi plantation 6 months earlier, information that had reached Charleston through a letter from the trader who had sold her. What and sold, what and falled, UN. Sold her. Constance delivered this news, while selecting china patterns, her tone suggesting no more emotional weight than a report of spoiled preserves. Pause for a moment and reflect on what it meant to be told of your child's death as an afterthought, to receive the information that your daughter had died alone and far from home in the same breath as instructions about table settings. Consider the psychological violence of a system that could make one woman's deepest grief into another woman's casual observation, a system that had so thoroughly dehumanized its victims that their suffering registered as mere inconvenience or administrative detail. Hattie's response, according to those who were present, was to lower her eyes and say, "Yes, ma'am." She returned to the kitchen and continued her work, but over the following days, as Thanksgiving approached, Hattie began to move through the plantation with a new deliberateness. She spoke to the other enslaved workers in the great house in hushed conversations that stopped when white people approached. She made several trips to the marshy areas beyond the quarters, returning with basket loads of roots and leaves that she claimed were for seasoning and holiday preparations. She requested permission to use the still house to prepare special extracts and tinctures for the feast, a request that Constance Whitmore granted without question, as Hattie's culinary skills had always been beyond reproach. Among the enslaved community, there were whispers that something was shifting. Mama Celia, who had known Hattie since childhood, watched her with growing unease and tried to engage her in conversation, but Hattie deflected with assurances that she was simply tired from the feast preparations. The stable hand, a man named Jupiter, who was 55, and had survived more than 4 decades of bondage, later testified that Hattie had come to him 3 days before Thanksgiving and asked him to ensure that the road to Charleston would be passable after the feast, a strange request that he could not interpret at the time. A young house servant named Patience, only 16, would recall that Hattie had given her a small cloth bundle and told her to hide it in her cabin and not to eat or drink anything from the great house on Thanksgiving night, instructions that Patience followed out of respect for Hattie's authority in the kitchen hierarchy, though she did not understand their purpose. The plant that Hattie used was later identified by a Charleston physician as white snakeroot, a native species that grows prolifically in shaded, moist areas throughout the South. White snakeroot contains tremetal, a toxic alcohol that causes acute poisoning when ingested in sufficient quantities. The symptoms include trembling, vomiting, severe abdominal pain, and eventual death from respiratory failure, though the onset can be delayed by several hours depending on dosage. What made white snakeroot particularly insidious was that it could be masked in rich, heavily seasoned foods, and that its effects might not appear until the meal was long concluded, making it difficult to identify the source of the poisoning. Hattie had learned about white snakeroot from Mama Celia years earlier, in the context of warning about plants that cattle should avoid, but Hattie had filed this knowledge away with the same careful attention she gave to every other piece of information that might someday prove useful. Over the course of 3 days, she had gathered enough white snakeroot to prepare an extract that she incorporated into multiple dishes, served exclusively to the white guests, avoiding the foods that the enslaved servers would eat, and carefully calculating doses that would be fatal, but not immediately so. Thanksgiving Day, 1859, arrived with clear skies and unseasonably warm weather, the kind of golden autumn day that planters took as evidence of divine favor. The 12 guests began arriving in the early afternoon, their carriages rolling up the oak-lined drive to the great house where Colonel Whitmore stood ready to receive them with bourbon and cigars. These men represented the apex of low country society, plantation owners whose combined holdings included thousands of acres and more than 1,500 enslaved people, men who sat on church vestries and bank boards, men who had served in the state legislature, and who considered themselves the natural aristocracy of the South. They gathered in the front parlor, discussing cotton prices and the political tensions with the North, secure in their belief that their world was eternal and unassailable, that the enslaved people, moving silently through the house to prepare their feast, were content with their lot, incapable of the kind of calculated resistance that required planning and moral judgment. If you are finding these stories as disturbing and illuminating as they are meant to be, consider subscribing to Shadows of the South, where we continue to examine the buried histories that shaped America, the stories that reveal uncomfortable truths about power, violence, and the human capacity for both cruelty and resistance. The feast began at 5 o'clock, as the November sun began its descent, filling the dining room with amber light that glinted off crystal and silver. Hattie and 3 other enslaved servers moved through the room with practiced precision, placing platters and bowls on the long mahogany table while the white men took their seats, and Constance Whitmore led them in a prayer of thanksgiving for God's blessings and the bounty of the harvest. The irony of this prayer, spoken over food prepared by people who were themselves considered property, over a table served by people who had no legal right to their own children, seems to have occurred to no one except possibly Hattie, who stood against the wall with her hands folded and her eyes downcast, the perfect image of submission. The meal progressed through multiple courses over 3 hours, and by all accounts, it was a culinary triumph. The guests praised the preparation, the seasoning, the perfect balance of flavors. They ate heartily, drinking toasts to the Colonel and his family, to the South and its sacred institutions, to the preservation of their way of life against the meddling of Northern abolitionists. No one noticed that the servers did not taste the food, as they sometimes did when checking seasoning, that Hattie remained in the kitchen more than usual, that the enslaved people who moved through the dining room had a kind of tension in their shoulders that might have been visible to anyone who was actually looking at them as human beings, rather than as animated furniture. By 8 o'clock, the guests had retired to the parlor for brandy and cigars, their bellies full, and their minds dulled by wine and self-satisfaction. This was when the first symptoms began. Colonel John Hartwell, a 60-year-old planter from a neighboring district, complained of nausea and stepped outside for air. Within 15 minutes, he was vomiting violently and had collapsed on the veranda. Others soon followed. By 9 o'clock, all 12 guests and Colonel Whitmore himself were experiencing severe trembling, abdominal cramping, and difficulty breathing. The house erupted into chaos as Constance Whitmore screamed for the stable hands to ride for the doctor, as enslaved servants ran between prostrate white men who writhed on floors and furniture, as the careful social order of the plantation dissolved into a scene of medical horror that no one could explain or control. Reflect on this moment of transformation, when the invisible people who had prepared the feast suddenly became the only ones capable of action, when the masters who had commanded absolute authority were reduced to helpless suffering, when the hierarchy that had seemed as natural as gravity was revealed to be merely a fiction maintained by violence and law. In that house on Thanksgiving night, the enslaved workers witnessed their owners' mortality and vulnerability in a way that shattered every mythology of white supremacy, even as they tried desperately to help, even as they fetched water and cloths and whispered prayer, because their humanity persisted despite everything that had been done to crush it. The doctor arrived near midnight, riding hard from Charleston, but by then 6 of the men were already dead. He could do nothing but administer palliatives and watch as the others followed over the next 5 hours. By dawn on the day after Thanksgiving, 12 men were dead, and Colonel Whitmore lay in his bed barely clinging to life. his body racked with tremors, and his mind cycling through delirium and brief moments of agonizing clarity. He would survive another 3 days before succumbing on the following Monday, the last victim of what Charleston newspapers would initially report as a tragic case of food poisoning, possibly from contaminated oysters or spoiled meat. The investigation began immediately, led by the Charleston sheriff and a magistrate who understood that the simultaneous death of 13 prominent white men could not be dismissed as mere accident. The enslaved workers of the Whitmore plantation were interrogated one by one, and it was Mama Celia who finally broke, unable to bear the weight of knowledge she had intuited but had tried to deny. She told the authorities about Hattie's trips to the marsh, about the tinctures prepared in the stillhouse, about the strange intensity that had overtaken her after learning of Lucy's death. When the sheriff's men searched Hattie's cabin, they found botanical specimens and notes written in a careful hand that documented the properties of various plants, evidence of illiteracy that was itself illegal under South Carolina law, and that suggested a level of planning that terrified white Charleston. Hattie did not deny what she had done. When confronted, she stood in the parlor of the great house, in the same room where the men had drunk their toasts to Southern civilization, and she confirmed that she had poisoned the feast, that she had done so with full knowledge and intent, that she regretted only that Constance Whitmore had not been present at the dinner to share the fate of the men. She offered no justification and no apology. She simply stated facts in a flat voice that one observer described as eerily calm, as though she had already moved beyond the reach of anything white society could do to her, now that her children were dead and her life's purpose had been fulfilled. The question of how to respond to this act paralyzed Charleston's legal and social establishment. By law, Hattie should be tried and executed, but the trial would require publicly acknowledging that an enslaved woman had successfully planned and executed a mass murder of white men, a narrative that threatened every assumption about enslaved people's intelligence, agency, and capacity for resistance. It would require admitting that the people white Southerners claimed to know intimately, whose inner lives they claimed to understand and control, were in fact strangers capable of maintaining perfect deception while plotting elaborate revenge. The trial would necessarily explore Hattie's motives, which would mean acknowledging the sale of her children, the sexual violence she had endured, the casual cruelty that defined her existence, acknowledgments that would undermine the mythology of slavery as a benign paternalistic institution. Pause and consider the moral incoherence of a society that could not publicly recognize the humanity and suffering of enslaved people, even when confronted with the most dramatic evidence of both. A society so committed to its own lies that it would distort legal proceedings to avoid acknowledging uncomfortable truths. A society that valued its myths more than justice or truth, or any coherent moral principle. The trial was held in late December 1859, conducted with unusual speed and minimal publicity. Hattie was appointed a lawyer who made no meaningful defense, and the proceedings focused narrowly on the facts of the poisoning, while avoiding any exploration of context or motive. She was convicted of murder within 2 days, and sentenced to death by hanging. The Charleston newspapers reported the case in terse language that emphasized the barbarity of the crime and the swift justice of the verdict, with no mention of the circumstances that had preceded it, and no acknowledgement of the children Hattie had lost, or the system that had brutalized her. Hattie was executed on January 12, 1860, in the Charleston jail yard, before a small crowd of officials and curious observers. Witnesses reported that she walked to the gallows without resistance, that she declined to make any final statement, and that she died with the same mask-like expression that had characterized her final weeks, her inner life remaining impenetrable to the white people who had claimed to own even her thoughts. The aftermath of the Whitmore massacre rippled through Charleston society in ways both visible and hidden. The deaths of 12 prominent men in a single evening created a collective trauma that the white community struggled to process, and the explanation offered publicly that a barbaric slave had poisoned her betters in an act of inexplicable savagery only partially succeeded in containing the anxiety that the case provoked. Many white families began to view their enslaved house servants with new suspicion, wondering what thoughts lay behind the obedient faces, what knowledge of herbs and poisons might exist in communities that had lived with southern plants for generations. Some plantation owners instituted new rules about kitchen work and food preparation, requiring white oversight at every stage, though these measures were impractical and ultimately abandoned as the logistics of slavery made such supervision impossible. Among the enslaved community, the story of Hattie circulated in whispered conversations and coded songs, becoming part of the hidden history of resistance that was never recorded in official documents but that persisted in collective memory. The truth of what she had done and why she had done it was understood in ways that white society could never acknowledge. She had asserted her humanity in the only way left to her. She had refused to accept that her children's deaths meant nothing. She had transformed her grief into an action that could not be ignored or dismissed. Whether this action constituted justice or murder, or some inexpressible third category that transcended the moral framework of slaveholding society, remains a question that cannot be answered simply, but it stands as testament to the psychological warfare that slavery enacted on both enslaved and enslaver, the way it corrupted every human relationship and made genuine peace impossible. The Whitmore plantation continued to operate under the management of a distant cousin who inherited the property after Colonel Whitmore's death, but it never recovered its former prosperity or prestige. Constance Whitmore retreated to her family's home in Savannah and lived out her remaining years in bitter seclusion, dying in 1867 without ever speaking publicly about the events of November 1859. The great house itself burned under mysterious circumstances in 1862 during the chaos of the Civil War, when Union forces were approaching Charleston and enslaved people throughout the Low Country were fleeing to freedom. Whether the fire was accidental or deliberate was never determined, but by war's end, only the foundation stones remained, gradually being reclaimed by the marsh grasses and palmetto scrub that had been there before white settlement. Of the enslaved people who witnessed the massacre, most were sold or scattered during the war and Reconstruction, their subsequent lives lost to historical record. Mama Celia died in 1861, some said of heartbreak over Hattie's fate and her own role in revealing what had happened. Jupiter, the stable hand, lived to see emancipation and remained in the Charleston area, working as a ferryman and dying in 1881 at the age of 77. Patience, the young house servant, who had received Hattie's warning not to eat the feast food, survived the war and Reconstruction to become a respected figure in Charleston's black community, though she never spoke publicly about what she had witnessed that Thanksgiving night. The knowledge of Hattie's children, where they had been sold, whether any survived slavery, whether any descendants live today, was lost in the systematic destruction of records that accompanied slavery's end and the white South's desire to erase evidence of their crimes. The story of Hattie and the Whitmore massacre was largely forgotten by white Charleston, buried under the mythology of the lost cause and the carefully constructed narratives about faithful slaves and benevolent masters that dominated Southern historiography for more than a century after the Civil War. It survived primarily in black oral tradition and in the fragmentary evidence of court records and newspaper accounts that historians began to excavate only in recent decades as part of the broader project of recovering the hidden histories of slavery and resistance. What the story reveals, beyond its immediate horror, is the psychological impossibility of the world that white Southerners tried to construct a world that required believing enslaved people were simultaneously content with bondage and in need of violent control, simultaneously incapable of complex thought and in need of constant surveillance, simultaneously part of the extended plantation family and available for sale or sexual exploitation without meaningful consequence. Consider what it meant to live in such a world, to be Colonel Whitmore or Constance, to construct elaborate justifications for a system that required denying the humanity of the people who cooked your food and raised your children and witnessed your every weakness and vulnerability. Consider the constant paranoia that must have existed beneath the surface calm, the knowledge that the foundations of your prosperity and identity rested on violence and exploitation that you could never fully acknowledge. And consider what it meant to be Hattie or any of the millions of enslaved people who navigated this impossible world with nothing but their wits and their capacity for endurance, who maintained their humanity despite systematic attempts to destroy it, who sometimes chose resistance, even when resistance meant certain death, because death with dignity seemed preferable to life without it. The Thanksgiving Massacre of 1859 stands as one of the most disturbing episodes in the long history of American slavery, disturbing not because it was unique, but because it made visible the violence that permeated every aspect of the system, the violence that white society worked constantly to obscure behind mythologies of paternalism and claims of civilized superiority. Hattie's action was itself an act of violence, and we should not romanticize it or pretend that poisoning 13 men represents any kind of ethical ideal, but neither can we understand it outside the context of the violence that preceded it, the violence of slavery itself, the violence of children stolen and sold, of bodies used and discarded, of grief dismissed as irrelevant, of humanity systematically denied until the only remaining form of self-assertion was an action so extreme that it could not be ignored. These stories matter not because they provide simple moral lessons or comfortable narratives of justice prevailed, but because they reveal the truth of what slavery was and what it cost, not just in the suffering of enslaved people, but in the moral destruction of the society that enslaved them. They remind us that the legacy of slavery is not safely contained in the past, but continues to shape American society in ways we are still struggling to acknowledge and address. They challenge us to look unflinchingly at the foundations of American prosperity and to recognize that they were built on crimes that we have never fully reckoned with, crimes whose consequences persist in racial inequality, in mass incarceration, in the systematic devaluation of Black lives that continues to this day. The story of Hattie forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice and vengeance, about the limits of empathy and the nature of resistance, about what we owe to those who have been systematically oppressed, and what forms of response to oppression we are willing to recognize as legitimate. It offers no easy answers, only the undeniable fact of what happened when one woman decided that her children's deaths would not pass unmarked, that the men who had built their world on her suffering would pay some price, even if that price was also her own life. In the end, perhaps the only honest response is to bear witness to what happened, to refuse to let Hattie and her children and the millions like them disappear into comfortable silence, and to commit ourselves to building a society where such stories belong only to history and not to any possible future.